So good morning or good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you join us from. Thank you for joining today's webinar titled Times of Arrival from Estimated to Predicted. We actually have an amazing lineup of speakers for you today who are going to discuss some of the most critical topics that are on the minds of everyone in the supply chain industry. And I'm sure that you'll have some actionable takeaways to take from their discussion. And we will do our best to leave time for questions at the end of the session. So feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A box and not in the chat box. You can do that at any time during the webinar, and questions will be read anonymously at the end of it. Now, at the end of the webinar, all attendees will get a summary email that includes a link to the recording. And now, without any further delays, I'd like to hand it over to Joe Peak, who is the moderator of this session. So enjoy the webinar, and Joe, over to you.
Thanks, Gilles. Appreciate the introduction. And also thanks to all of the panelists joining us today. It's a jam-packed agenda, and I think just very quickly before we get into the agenda, just a quick round of introductions. I think I'll go first as I'm refereeing today's panel. I'm actually the Commercial Director of Ocean Freight Visibility at Windward, and I really lead our efforts to understand our customers' pain points around the opaqueness of ocean milestone information, most notably the ETA, which sort of brings me here today. Bjorn, you're the first on the list, so why don't you take it away?
All right, okay. My name is Bjorn Jensen. I am a Dane, as some can hear from the accent, based in Copenhagen, working for Sea Intelligence, which is a data analytics and supply chain advisory firm, very focused on containerized shipments, but diving deeper into supply chain. Before that, a long and glorious past with Electrolux as head of global logistics. And I even tried my hand at being on the other side at the freight movement part with both carriers and 3PLs. So that's what I bring to the party.
Good to have you, Bjorn. Thanks a lot. Judah, why don't you go next?
Thanks for having me. I'm Judah Levine. I'm head of research at Freightos Group. Freightos is a logistics technology company. We're working to be a global booking platform for international freight. And that comprises our Freightos.com marketplace, which connects thousands of importers, exporters with dozens of freight forwarders on online marketplace to book freight. And our web cargo business unit, which connects through SaaS and e-booking platforms to connect carriers and freight forwarders. In addition, we also have our Freightos data unit, which, because of these different connections, we have a lot of insights into a lot of different data, including the basis for our Freightos Baltic Index, which is a daily spot rate index for containerized freight. And I also, kind of based on the FBX, I produce a weekly update on what's going on in the market.
Awesome. Thanks, Judah. And Dani, last but not least.
Yes. Hey, guys. So I'm Dani. I've been working on developing and researching the deep learning models at Windward for quite some time now. Prior to that, I've worked at Microsoft for many years. I worked on the project called HoloLens, which is Microsoft augmented reality headset. I've lived in Seattle. I've relocated to Seattle for several years and then came back to Israel. And generally, I've been doing pretty much all AI for the last, 7 years.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And thanks everyone for introducing themselves. So just kind of to set the scene very quickly, we're going to be tackling some very big topics, not only the complexity of the ETA, the factors that influence that ETA, but also having a look at, I think, the wild world of freight rates. And Judah, it's great to have you here for that. But on top of this, we want to understand what role is technology playing, and of course, how AI is then supporting us to get from estimated to predicted, especially around that ETA. But I think firstly, one of the largest influences on an estimated time of arrival, and the one that probably grabs the most headlines, is indeed port congestion, right? So Windward very keenly monitors this, and most recently we partnered with Sea Intelligence. Bjorn, great to have you. And we've been analyzing the current performance of ports. We've looked at some of those leading indicators to assess how do we understand that as an industry we're approaching a state of congestion. So on the left-hand side, very quickly on this slide, we have the transits into the US West Coast. In January 2022, we saw an increase of 99% in transit time compared to 21, right? So a pretty bad state of affairs. Lots of ports were losers, but I think the call-outs here are Xiamen and Busan, substantially worse off. And on the right-hand side, the port of Shanghai having substantial impacts on transits, as indeed carriers look to slow steam ahead of congestion. Bjorn, I want to bring you into this because obviously this is a few months old. I mean, what is your view of the picture today, and has there been any change?
Well, there's been changes on individual ports. Shanghai obviously has recovered quite well. Chinese ports in general have recovered quite well. The big talk right now is not anymore on what will happen when Shanghai opens up. Shanghai is open, and as we predicted, Shanghai opened in a very orderly fashion, a very efficient manner, as we were hoping and praying and pretty convinced would happen. And that happened. So that is no longer a stumbling block, although I will say that there is a lot of fear right now around both Xi'an and Shanghai. Of course, from a shipping standpoint, Shanghai is more interesting. That we're again seeing rates go up, and that's not even including this new B5 variant and whatever that has potential to absolutely wreak havoc on ports. I think we also need to remember, as we do these charts, that we are in the middle of monsoon season in Asia, so it is not completely unheard of for there to be blips in schedule accuracy. But that kind of neatly segues into the next slide, I believe, Gilles, if you wouldn't mind. Okay, here we go. I need to move everybody. So basically, what we're seeing here is Sea Intelligence's global liner performance measurements, which is a monthly report we put out. And I know it looks very busy, but actually it's as simple as this. Every year has a separate color, right? And this is the number of times the vessels were on time relative to the original schedule they put out, not the revised one or the revised one, because then everybody is 100%. We take the originally advised schedule and we measure against that. And so what we see obviously down below in the dark blue and light orange colors is 2021, 2022. Look, 2019 wasn't fantastic either. 2020 things went south, but 21 was absolutely horrible, and 22 has been even worse. Bottom line is that globally, and this is an amalgam of a range of trades where we do monitor every trade, but globally, vessels are on time relative to their original schedule 36.4% of the time. There is nobody who could describe this almost as liner shipping. This is not liner shipping. This is tramp trade. Bulk carriers have a higher schedule reliability than so-called liner shipping. And it is something that everybody's keenly aware of. There are a ton of reasons for it. We can see inching up slightly in May. These data are always about a month delayed, hence the lag. This is the latest and the greatest. But if you go to the next slide, Gilles, this measures the average delay for these vessels that are late. All right, so for the 73% of vessels that are 67% of vessels that are late, how late are they? And here, obviously, the orange, which was 2021, it got really, really bad with a height of almost 8 days late compared to the originally published schedule. That number has come down somewhat, and there are multiple reasons for why it's come down. Well, Shanghai actually gave everyone a bit of a breathing space to get back on track. Congestion, berthing congestion in the US West Coast has abated somewhat as well. Port congestion, not by a mile has it abated. It's only gotten worse. And current events, like as we speak with truck strikes and everything, is going to make it even worse, right? But Shanghai did buy everyone a breathing space. And in any case, as much as people will bang their chest and say, see, now we're less late, well, the actual fact is, no, now you're just as late as you were in 2021. Right. The jury is out on whether you will follow that curve, because then maybe the chest beating came a bit too early. Go to the next slide, Jim. So here you have the average delay for all vessel arrivals, not just the ones who were late. And here we have essentially a little bit like, I think it's around 3.2%. 3.2 days is the average delay for all vessels, not just those who were late, right? So that takes us into the next slide. And I think everybody sees the problem here. Gilles, would you change slides? Everybody sees the problem here, okay? first of all, the chart here is not meant to call out anybody. This chart moves around all the time. Okay, there are winners and there are losers, and it changes every month. There are some carriers who are better than others. Maersk and Hamburg Süd are obviously the glaring outliers. If you can call something that's on time half the time a positive outlier, then yes, they are an outlier, and they have been so for quite some time. Bear in mind, again, these are global numbers, so this will also include, for example, schedules that were outside of the M2 arrangement. It says overall, yes, there are some outliers, and then everybody sort of clusters around the 28 to 33% on time. So don't necessarily use this chart to pick carriers. Use it to be aware that the landscape changes all the time as to who's late and who's not, and even the best are horrendous. Okay,
Bjorn, I just want to pause for a second there, because I want to get into like why the ETA is so complex and why it's so important in probably a bit further down in the webinar. Just one of the things that you mentioned previously about the way that you actually assess carrier reliability and the carrier schedules. You take the original schedule that's published. One of the things most notable in Europe that's just recently happened is, of course, the threat of strikes I think it was in Hamburg, in Germany. And what Maersk has done in response to that, they've actually just reset all of their sailing schedules, right?
Yes.
So we're seeing carriers behave that way time and time again. Can you give us some insights in that, that they reset their schedule, so they want to enhance their performance, but we know
they reset their schedule. So what happens is when it can only enhance your schedule overall if you omit a port that's potentially not actually working, standing still. It creates a load of problems otherwise, because now you're going to offload boxes in a different port, and somebody's going to have to pay to truck them up or feeder them up to where they were originally supposed to go, and it creates havoc with your equipment positioning programs as well if you're a carrier, because your equipment as in container positioning plans globally they tend to be built around those big services months and months and months and months out. So when those services change, so will the equipment positioning program, and it could potentially leave an awful lot of containers in the wrong place. And that may or may not have knock-on effects all the way back out to Asia. They're not there to be exported from Europe, and they need to make it empty out to Asia. The dance goes on and on and on. Now, from a measuring standpoint, of course, we actually, if you looked at the whole data set that we use to produce these numbers, we measure per string. Okay. So if there's a new string or the string changes, then that string, the measure will also change. And there'll be a cutoff time when we no longer measure the old string, but we measure the new string. So that can be managed. But I don't believe that Maersk's reset of schedules is going to last. Very, very tricky to pretend that you're going to be serving Northern Europe without Hamburg and Bremerhaven is a bit ridiculous, yeah. So short-term effect, yes. The long, medium-term effect on container availability, almost certainly. Long-term effect, not really.
Sure. Okay.
But if I may here, Joe, just because I did jot down some bullet points here to try and answer your questions from my standpoint, and the vast majority of my experience, both on the buy side of the table as well as an advisor, has been with cargo owners. I don't do a lot of work with carriers, even though I used to be one for my sins, right? But so I look at this through the eyes of a cargo, an importer. Really wants to know, where is my cargo? Sure. Right? It's because of planning. Okay, a lot of BCOs are manufacturers. We plan our factory runs according to a certain amount of inventory. Some of it is more critical than others. Some of it we store more of than others. Some of it we simply can't move in on a steady stream because there's not enough of it to fill a container, in which case we are the air freight or LCL. But bottom line is, when this thing starts getting, on average, 3.5 days late, then I have two options. Fundamentally, eventually, I either stop my factory because the part didn't make it, or I start building in buffer stock because I know that vessels tend to be late. Over here, that chart over here might be useful in that context from a carrier selection standpoint, bearing in mind that it's a dynamic chart. But if you close a factory, it varies by industry. In Electrolux and many other, let's say, electronics manufacturing companies, we work on the assumption that closing a factory costs somewhere between 500,000 and €1 million a day.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's not an option. There's not an option for a whole bunch of reasons. One of them being that carriers are not liable for that stuff. There are very, very few ocean contracts out there where where carriers are liable for this kind of thing, right? So it does cost millions, whether we need to expedite with air cargo, whether we need to find sea air options or other premium modes.
Yeah.
But we do know that ETAs are the rule, and that even the best are only on time 50% of the time. We also know that land issues cause a lot of it. But fundamentally, as a shipper, we've seen a lot of people out there who try to crack the code. All right, a lot of companies that are offering, all seeing, all dancing visibility systems. Some of them have got close. Some of them have not even thought about it. Some of them, but none of them has cracked the code 100%. All right. Enter AI, which is, I'm very happy to hand off to someone else, a broad understanding of what it is. But
let's just take a step back for a second, Bjorn, because we're getting a bit of ahead of ourselves here. I just wanted to just sort of round off on congestion as a whole. You mentioned there that some shippers, some BCOs have changed their behaviors. And one of the big ones that we've seen is a shift from the West Coast imports to East Coast, and that's just shifted the issue of congestion, right? Yeah. So we're now seeing build up on the East Coast. Judah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that sort of shifting in behavior and the impacts it's had on the East Coast.
Yeah, definitely. So I think like we saw in Bjorn's first couple of slides, we've seen kind of an improvement, or a moderate, if you can term it improvement, in terms of schedule reliability and in terms of transit times and things like that. And I think a lot of that is attributable to some of that shift from East Coast to West Coast. I'm sorry, from West Coast to East Coast. So for shipments booked on Freightos.com, we can look at the transit time. And we've also seen a gradual decline in transit time since a peak of about 80 days, which was earlier in the year. This is about a 25% drop, but it's still about 50% longer than it would normally take pre-pandemic. And so some of those improvements that we're seeing on the West Coast, so they had a peak of 100 ships waiting towards the beginning of the year. That's down to the 20s. Again, the 20 ships waiting is not good. Typically at this time of year, there would be a couple, and in non-peak times, there'd be zero. And some of that congestion has just been shifted to the other side. So in some reports that we saw last week, there's something like more than 100 ships off the coast of North America. Totally, 2/3 of those are not on the West Coast. So that we see congestion building elsewhere. So it's kind of just a shifting around. And in Europe as well, as Bjorn touched on, there's still big problems with congestion. So congestion causes delays that then impacts a transit time and ETA. But at the same time, bad schedule reliability also causes congestion. So if we shift to like the origin ports, as Bjorn mentioned, there's growing problems. There have been problems off and on in Asian origins. There's problems now in terms of different restrictions with COVID testing in different areas, and as he said, with weather. So when there's problems and delays at origin ports, that pushes schedules off for destination ports. And that's kind of been a big problem especially for European ports, where there hasn't been such a surge in volumes. But if ships aren't arriving on schedule, but arriving at the same time, that also causes a backlog. So I think both of those things are contributing. We have kind of an attempt to shift to alternatives, which, if the volumes are such that they're going to overwhelm the port capacity, wherever it's shifted to, although things have, there've been a lot of steps taken to improve that. But on the other hand, when there's problems at origin ports, that also throws schedules off, which itself causes congestion. So it's kind of two sides of the same coin.
Right. I won't bring in Bjorn now to discuss ocean carrier scheduling, because I know it's a passionate topic for him. But I think what I'm hearing here is that we've even touched on we're going into monsoon season, congestion, schedule reliability, port efficiencies. All of these things are adding to the complexity of predicting that ETA. I want to bring in Dani here because he has, I believe, a different perspective on this. He's someone that's been so close to the data, right? That fragmented data set, cleansing, standardizing that. Dani, from your standpoint, on your side of the fence, like what are some of the factors you've had to overcome when looking at that ETA?
Yes, so I think the factors you need to overcome is pretty much you have to get very acquainted with all the data types that you've just mentioned. Because I think that, like when you want to apply AI, so a good, rule of thumb for when to apply it. So if you want to, so it's in cases that you want to make one prediction and that prediction has a lot of data into it. So it takes a very long time to make the prediction. So even if you try to do this thing manually, right? So predicting like when would one ship reach one port would take, a data analyst, like, I don't know, an hour or 2 hours, right? So and that's, of course, that's just to make some prediction, right? And the other thing is that you want to make lots and lots and lots and lots of those predictions, right? Because there are many, many ships going to many, many ports. And even if we're talking about one ship, people are waiting for the cargo in different ports and you have to make multiple predictions for the same ship, right? Like when does the ship reach New York? And then when will it be at the West Coast? And everything is interdependent. So I think, this is why we need AI here, because the complexity of a single prediction is very high. There's lots of data going into a single prediction. Then we need to make thousands and thousands of those predictions every day. So if we were to try this manually, we would literally need hundreds and hundreds of people trying to do this manually, and that's.
So Dani, I'm keen to get to AI in a couple of steps because I know that you have a slide there to sort of introduce some of those complexities. But you've mentioned like in your description there just some of those layers of different data sets, etc. What then happens, for example, to the ETA and our understanding of that ETA when something like a major event happens in the supply chain? Like, how does that then impact some of those data sets that you're looking at?
Yes, so the idea is in AI to make stuff dynamic, right? So you need big data. So, big data for AI is years and years of data. So you can imagine you're taking the thing like, 3 or 4 or 5 years back to learn. But then, you wanted to adjust whatever's going on now, right? Like there's a war between Russia and Ukraine and everything, goes to, or there's a lockdown in China, in Shanghai, like we saw a while ago. So what you want the AI to do, you want it to be able to use current data for the prediction. A good example would be, I'm looking at a port. So here AI, here's everything that's going on in my target, my destination port. Like here's the ships that are already in there. Here's the ships that are incoming. Here's everything that is scheduled to happen in, I don't know, in LAX during the next week. Now go figure out like what is actually going to happen, right? Because there are a lot of ships, all of them have schedules for today and there are not enough cranes to move their containers around, right? So the AI kind of needs to, in every prediction, understand what's going to happen in every port along the way and then make an accurate prediction. And those things, it's not humanly possible, right? Without AI.
Sure. Okay. Thank you, Dani. Thanks for that. I just wanted to sort of be brave here for a second, but with the panel and try and bring in the discussion of freight rates, right? It's probably one of the most topical areas, especially if you're on the forwarding side of business. Most recently, we've partnered with yourself, Judah, and Freightos to explore this type of topic. But perhaps before we sort of deep dive into that, can you just give us some of your thoughts around that journey of rate volatility and sort of what's prompted that? I think you have a slide as well. Thanks. Yeah,
sure. So, here we're looking at the global container index, which is, has the components of all the major trade lanes. But this does tell the kind of the overall story. And you see we're starting from a little more than 2 years ago. And we see rates started, around $1,500 per container. We had this pretty significant increase over the second half of 2020. And this is as consumers shifted to spending more on goods than on services as, kind of the pandemic set in, especially in the United States. there was a big increase in spending on goods, which 90% of which go by ocean freight. And to make a long story short, those increased volumes and increased demand quickly led also to congestion, which just sucks up capacity and further kind of restricts supply as demand continues to grow. We see this big leap last year at peak season. We see from July 2021. And again, this is as volumes continue to be strong, demand continued to be strong, but congestion was making everything take that much longer. And though there was some come down after peak season last year, rates remained pretty stable. Again, because of that demand, there was a lot of pull forward of demand earlier than peak season, as shippers were trying to avoid the delays we saw before. But in the last couple of months, we've seen a drop off. So if we go to the next slide and talk about that a little more in brief, right. Here we see the Trans-Pacific lanes in blue, and Asia Europe in yellow. Transatlantic is in green, and we see that for Asia Europe, we started to see a decline after Lunar New Year this year. Rates have declined about 30% since January, February. And that's kind of typical or seasonal. I think the drop was a little more pronounced than it might have normally was. And, the indication early on is this is driven by inflation. As, inflation is making things cost more, we're seeing a drop in demand from Asia, Europe. To the US, we saw rates stay stable longer. And into the lockdown, they stayed stable for a bit in Shanghai. That started in April, and then rates started to fall, especially in May and June. So initially, the hypothesis was that Shanghai is shut down, things can't get out, so there's a drop in demand, but underlying demand is strong. But even as things start to open up in June, rates continue to fall. Now they've fallen about 50% since the start of the year, or since about March, which they're about the same level. And there's been other indications that inflation and to some extent the opening up of economies and people able to spend more on services and goods is also contributing. But it really seems that inflation has been the biggest driver, because we've seen this big decrease in freight rates over that time. So it seems like underlying demand is finally starting to shift. It seems like inflation is the driver and not is the biggest driver, and not the reopening of the economies, which back 2 years ago that was kind of the hypothesis. But there remains to be seen a lot of questions about what this will mean for peak season moving forward. As I said, a lot of that demand was pulled forward earlier in the year. Ocean volumes are still extremely high. There are some projections on the Trans-Pacific that they're going to start to decline over the coming months. But those volumes, as well as these rates, even though they're falling, are still extremely elevated compared to normal. So, rates we see now have come down today in the Trans-Pacific to the West Coast is less than $7,000 per container, which sounds good compared to 20, maybe a year ago. But compared to pre-pandemic norms of like $1,500, $2,000 is still extremely elevated. And, to get back to our discussion, congestion is also a big driver of that. So, even if consumer demand is finally decreasing, congestion is going to suck up some of that capacity until it starts to unwind. So I think we're kind of seeing the beginning of this, but all these different factors are going to keep things, above normal for some time.
I wonder if you've seen, because thinking back to my forwarding days when we were working with customers, that, $20,000 a container for Far East westbound trade, that was the FAK. People would just stop shipping, right? There simply wasn't the margin within the product in order to sustain that freight rate. Do you think some of those shippers are now going to start coming back online with the decline in freight rates, and maybe that will level out some of the releasing capacity? Like, what do you think there?
Yeah, well, I mean, a couple of things. First of all, the FBX was included premium surcharges. So it wasn't FAK, it was FAK plus premiums. At the time, that was basically the market rate, because you couldn't really ship without paying a premium. Just for accuracy's sake, as premiums have been removed and not necessary, that's part of what's driven some of the sharp decline. But again, reflecting the market reality. The other kind of caveat is that FBX is a spot rate index. So there's a lot of volumes that are also moving by container, which typically is below the spot rate. It's getting interesting now as the spot rate has dipped below the contract rate for a lot of shippers. So that's another problem that has to be dealt with. Another thing that can add to some instability. But I think the amazing thing is that if you look at ocean volumes, they were at record highs. So despite the incredibly high freight rates, shippers who could were still shipping. Now, of course, there'd be some businesses and some products for which it was no longer economically viable to ship at that kind of rate. But again, there's actually a big mix of what shippers are paying. There's a big mix of margin. So it really it depends how bulky your goods are and how many you're able to fit on a ship. So I think especially small businesses have probably impacted more. Larger businesses, as we know, some of them were chartering their own container ships, which I assume is very expensive, and we're kind of able to absorb that. But on the other hand, this is also some of this is being passed along to consumers. So if you were losing some of your margins, there's also part of the driving of inflation was raising freight rates. Certainly wasn't the only driver, but it was certainly one of them. So I think the answer is it depends on who the shipper was. It depends on what their contract arrangement was. But it certainly priced some out of the market. But what we saw overall was that there was some resiliency to absorb these costs, or more likely to be passed them on to consumers.
Mm-hmm. No, that's really interesting. Thanks, Judah. And I think, look, I'm going to ask the question now because we're probably going to get a bit later. And I appreciate there's no crystal balls. We're not going to know what's going to happen moving forwards. There's no forward-looking curve as to where that rate's going to end up. But are there certain things that you'd like to see happen first within the market that would then enable rates to plateau and start to become a little bit more stable? Are there some leading indicators that you look for before that would happen?
Well, again, I think if we look at Asia, Europe, we see rates have been level since about May. And I think this is really a function of two things. One is, as we said already, congestion. As long as congestion is a big problem, and it's a big problem in Europe, it's going to continue to suck up some of that supply. And as long as demand stays, within reason the way it is, it's going to keep rates elevated. And I think that's what we're seeing to Europe. Just one other thing interesting for Europe, for Trans-Pacific, for Asia to the US, if we compare volumes in 2021 to pre-pandemic 2019, there's something like a more than 20% increase in volumes, 25% increase in volumes, and it makes sense. All those ships going over overwhelms ports, creates congestion. There's demand outstrips supply, and throw congestion on top of that. To Europe, I think it was maybe a 4% increase from 2021 to 2019 in terms of volumes, but nonetheless we had these incredibly high freight rates. Part of that is competing with Trans-Pacific shippers for ships and boxes and spots and origins, but part of it is just, as I said before, when schedule reliability is off or when port congestion is being caused by other things, it's also contributing to keeping rates up. And the last factor is capacity management by carriers. When ships aren't moving full, then they have proven the ability to manage capacity and try and match supply with demand. So that's another thing that will keep rates up. But I think across the board, things we're looking at, the big underlying driver is going to be consumer demand. And once that shifts and starts to have a significant or gradual come down, that's going to be what removes pressure on freight rates and on congestion. But as we've seen, kind of congestion, it's very hard to unwind. And just one last thing is that we expect consumer demand to mean fewer volumes, to mean less congested ports and container yards. One thing we're seeing now is that because all of a sudden some retailers are having this increase in inventory, excess inventory, but they've already ordered more containers on their way. And those containers get to the container yard, there's nowhere to put them. So we're seeing an increase in dwell time, not because of the different factors seen before, but because of a decrease in demand, which is a little bit counterintuitive. This decrease of demand is pushing some boxes already ordered back to the ports, which just slows everything else down.
Exactly. I just want to pull in Bjorn as well, because he's been patiently waiting there with his hand up. Bjorn, some comments.
There's a whole lot of things to unpack. I mean, with the retail inventory thing, I think we're going to have to agree to disagree, because our latest data show that the inventory to sales turn for retailers in North America is approaching 1.2, where it used to be 2.5 pre-pandemic. What that indicates is actually retailers are woefully short of inventory, as are wholesalers, whereas manufacturing companies may be sitting on more inventory now, or people who are importing finished products for distribution to retailers are sitting on are overstocked. We believe that there's a significant restocking exercise coming, which will create sort of a ghost peak or a false peak before the end of the year. And the problem is, with that ongoing congestion, a lot of which will switch back to the West Coast just as soon as the RWU thing resolves itself, and where it will meet with unheard of bottlenecks in infrastructure, we could basically be right back to square one. I do agree that with the comment that congestion alone absorbs capacity. I've quoted that number often. I think right now we're at global congestion absorbing almost 10% of freight capacity. To put that in numbers or the visual around it, that's the equivalent to CMA or Costco disappearing overnight. That's how much capacity globally is wiped out by congestion alone. You asked the question, Joe, will people come back to shipping if the rates drop? I think it's important to point out that there is no price elasticity in shipping the way economists talk about it in, for example, air travel, right? Where very clearly, if you lower the rate, then more people, your volume will go up because more people will travel who couldn't afford to travel before, right? That elasticity doesn't, just because Maersk lowers the rate to $2,000 doesn't mean I wake up in the morning and go, oh, I should ship something. The rate is low, right? The way I'd say, oh, I should go to Spain while I can, right? So I think those who have been priced out of the market and have somehow managed to survive, they've done so in part by finding alternative sources of supply, and I think are unlikely to return, or at least a great portion of them are unlikely to return to these trades because they've been burnt too many times. A whole other bunch of other stuff, which I completely agree with, this congestion situation, which is by and large not the carrier's fault. Let's get that clear. Congestion is not the fault of ocean carriers. Congestion is the fault of rail, it's the fault of terminal operators, it's the fault of trucking companies, it's the fault of supply chain planners. Right now, there are, as of this morning, there are 37,000 containers in the port of Long Beach and Los Angeles alone, which can't be loaded onto rail to go to interior points intermodal in the United States. Why? Because there aren't enough what do they call them, engineers, people who drive trains. And those few that remain, well, they wanted very badly to go on strike yesterday, along with 70,000 truck drivers who are now currently downing tools in the LA Long Beach area, except the engineers were told by executive order that they had to take a 30-day breathing period before they could strike. We are by no means out of the woods here.
Sure.
And we are by no means at a point where we can say we'll never again see 75 ships parked outside LA or more. We will.
Let's pick on carriers though for a second here, because I can appreciate that like the landside congestion is having a huge impact, especially on the ETA, right? But typically a price drop will follow the drop in demand, right? And a drop in demand, hopefully there's less congestion, but we still see carriers taking it into their own hands, blank sailing, trying to control like a bit of capacity, right? So that's always going to happen, right?
Yes, I think they're blanking, but I think there's also blanking that's taken place over these last 12 months at least, where carrier had no choice but to blank the sailing because they didn't have the bloody ship.
Yeah.
Because it was lying outside Long Beach when it should have been back in Asia, right? Yeah. And there's no spare capacity to put in there. So I don't know what the percentage of, a certain percentage of sailings across the carrier spectrum, the ship wasn't there. So how, right? Yes, for sure, they're also doing what we call tactical blank sailings, right? Which is a propping up of demand. And I also think we see vessels that are quite full now because we have what I call overhang, right? So we got boxes, all of a sudden that capacity available. We've got boxes that have been rolled for weeks and weeks and weeks, which are now being shipped. And they create the illusion of demand, where in fact that was past demand that's only now being serviced. And then you have also a very large overhang with people who order stuff in China, be it finished products or raw material, where this global recession threat and subsequent demand adjustments did not come soon enough for them to cancel those orders. So they're now stuck having to ship those orders out of China. So it's another illusory demand. It exists only because the recession struck too late for people to cancel those orders, right? And I think there will be a boom from some retailers, some wholesalers, and let's not forget, so long as all that happens in North America, we know that if you really want to pick on someone for this entire fiasco, pick on North America, because this is where it all began, and it's where it's all being perpetuated, right? Global container flows will, everything else being equal, be impacted when you can't get a ship into dock and when you can't get a container. And when you finally get it, you sit on it for 3 weeks, because let's pick on the importers as well. Nobody is blameless in this game. But I feel like, apart from the tactical blank sailings, which I'm no proponent of, I feel like carriers have been getting a bit of a raw deal for the transit time situations.
Sure, but I don't think they're really getting a raw deal on the misplacement of schedules, right? I mean, what happens after confirmed on board, or once it's left the port of lading? Fair enough, but the scheduling situation is still pretty dire.
It is, and if you go back to my last slide there, where I had that chart, Gilles, can you go back to my last slide just real quick? That one. What you'll see there, the second to last bullet point, a misdeclared product in the shape of the transit times that are being quoted is creating much of the issue. I could take, if any carrier gave me full reign to do anything, I promise you, today is Wednesday, we'd have 100% schedule reliability across every single trade on Monday.
Yeah.
Because I would simply say to people, especially the salespeople, on pain of long and slow and painful death and sacking, you will now stop lying to our customers, because that's what you're doing. You're blatantly lying when you say that the transit time is going to be 28 days, when you know it's going to be 45. I don't care what your performance schedule says. You know that this is simply not true. But if you're sitting on the client side, you have no choice but to go by this, plus maybe a little bit of a buffer, right? But you know you're being sold a lie or a fake bill of goods or whatever you want to call it. I'm sure you're going to end up in the press for this, but that's okay, because it's the truth, right? It's a fake bill of goods, right? So if carriers would just start telling the truth, we would know when stuff arrives.
Sure. I think let's try and shift gears here and take a look at like technology in the market, right, and the ways that we're trying to tackle this issue. I think let's try and bring Dani into this in terms of maritime AI. Like, what is maritime AI, and how do you think that like AI found itself within this domain?
Yes. So let's talk about what is maritime AI for a second. So, maybe a sentence or two. What is AI in general? So there's the famous machine learning, and then there is deep learning, which is a subset of a form of machine learning, or a subset of machine learning. And deep learning is referred to as AI because it's, this is the biggest breakthrough we've had in a long time. AI, the first time any kind of researcher made AI work in the lab for the first time was 2012, so 10 years ago. And then there are kind of two ways to do AI, right? So there's a lot of research going on in AI, like in the big companies, Facebook and Google and the universities. And if you can come up with, some problem that helps you, that they've solved, then you're good. A good example would be a translation model, right? Like AI that translates between different languages. And then if you want to do, translation for your sales representatives, you can just go ahead and use it. So unfortunately for us, neither Google nor Facebook nor Apple are opening source any kind of AI models that that have anything to do with maritime at all. So we needed to build our own. That's first. Secondly, there was a good question. I'm gonna answer it already in the Q&A. Whether are we doing knowledge-based AI? When you say knowledge-based AI, you pretty much mean there's an expert, an expert human doing it, and you're kind of showing the machine, here's the human expert doing it, do it as good as he does. A good example would be, you can take Garry Kasparov, and then you can take all the times he played chess, and you can tell, hey machine, go play chess like Garry Kasparov. So we don't have that, right? Unfortunately, we don't have an expert like Garry Kasparov in maritime, and we don't have lots of experts. So we're not doing knowledge-based AI. we're doing just, data-driven AI. What we do have, in Windward, we have lots of historical data about chips. So we know for the past, roughly a decade, since 2012, 2013, like how have ships behaved when they got into ports. We've been tracking ships for a very long time. And we've taken all of this information and we've built our own model that we're kind of showing you here. So the blue boxes, right? So each white box comes with the blue box. So let's go ahead one by one, and I think it would give people a good intuition of what we're trying to do. So there's the blips, right? Blips is the AIS transmission of the ship that would tell you where the ship is, how fast is it going, things like that. Then once the AI has all the blips of the ship, it can understand, okay, where am I going and what are the available routes to get to destination. Then you have the schedules, which are a totally different thing than blips, right? Those are different data domains. And one of the hard things we do in AI, we try to fuse together different data domains. So blips, it's AIS transmissions of ship. It's kind of, a GPS tracking of the ship. It's called AIS in shipping. And carrier schedule is, what we talked about in this conversation, and it's, schedules, like it's totally different than GPS. Then there's this ship's travel history, right? So different ships, so big ships would behave one way, small ships would behave another way, and each captain does, whatever he wants. So, a good thing about the ship's travel history would be, for the AI to figure out, well, if this captain comes to a congested port, would he just say, well, I'm not going to wait here, I'm just going to skip to another port and come back in 2 weeks? Or is he actually going to wait it out, right? So this decision is, is kind of captain-based, like every captain does differently. And you need to kind of figure it out from the ship's history, how would the captain react? Next thing is, forecast, weathers and stuff, right? Like if the ship's if there's a big storm and the port is congested and shut down, right? So when is the storm passing, right? Like how is the captain going to sail around the storm, things like that. And then, of course, there's the big issue of congestions in port. So what we're trying to do, we're trying to take all of those things, right? We have this block of neural network, right? It's like a mini neural network that would take each one of those things, the blips, the carrier schedules, the ship's history, and it would bring them into what, we can think about as AI language, right? So everything is translated into AI. And then we put them all into this, vertical thing in the middle, which is called the transformer, right? So a transformer, it's, it's the most cutting edge neural network architecture. And, it's kind of the greatest architecture for reasoning, right? So the AI gets in all the data and he goes like, well, the ship is kind of, it's approaching LAX, but I can see the congestion. The weather is okay, so I'm probably going to hang around here for like 3 days in the port waiting area, and then I'm going to go in. And then what the AI tells us, which is what we see on the right, so we get the ETA, right? And you can get an ETA up to 45 days ahead of arrival, and up to 20 ports ahead, which is super important, right? Because when you're trying to predict the arrival into the next port. So there's a lot of information from the captain. The captain usually reports, when am I going to get into the next port? But if your container is getting dropped like, 5 ports ahead, then this becomes a very hard problem, because you need to figure out where is the ship going to go from here. And for that, you have no information from the captain whatsoever. Right. Then, we need to be the order of, ports visits. Yeah. And then you need to kind of understand what's the dwell time in each port, right? Because the fact that, that the ship sailed to a port, right? Am I going to unload 400 containers or 4 containers, right? It makes a very big difference. And who to which carrier does this container, belong to, right? Of course, if there's like, our example is, there's a new Nike show, and the new Air Jordans are just shipping, and the container is going to be on time, right? They're going to throw another ship away and just put in the Nike ship. So that's kind of, what our model does. So because we haven't really had any chance to find similar things, right? Because Facebook and other and Google, the other companies, they're working on images and languages, but nobody cares about maritime data. But we did have years and years worth of data in the servers, right? So we just took all the data, and you know, the fun part for AI, we didn't even go through labeling, right? Because in AI, usually you send the data to data taggers, right? And they would look at images and they would like paint, this is a dog, this is a cat, things like that.
Yeah.
And for us, you know, we kind of have everything on the servers. We know the port codes, we know what happened to the ships, and we just push years and years. We're talking about millions and millions and millions of data points about ships, and we're pushing them all into the AI. And the AI kind of figures out, you know, how does maritime shipping behave, but it does it, you know, dynamically, like we talked before, right? So it calculates what's the current port congestion. What ship are you asking about? You know, what's the size? Who's the captain? How is it behaved before? What carrier is on your specific ship? And, you know, this makes the thing kind of work very well.
Or indeed, I guess that continual learning of there's a major event that's happened today. The Suez Canal is blocked. Something's gone on. There's a huge weather system that's come through, and that's caused an immediate disruption in a location. That model then learns from that, and then it impacts all the further ETS around.
Yes, so, of course. So you talk about data, right? So nothing happens for the first time, right? There's been many storms before, the Suez Canal has been blocked before, and congestion has been building up before, you know, over and over and over again. So what the AI does, it says, okay, here's what's going on, right? I can see that there's a storm, I can see the congestion, and, you know, he kind of understands how would this affect your current ship, because it's seen in the past, right? Different storms and different congestions affect other ships or your ship as well, right? Like the AI has learned from your ship as well, right? So it knows the ship. Like our AIs, it knows every container ship on the planet, right? It knows them all.
I think, Dani, let's try and move on now to sort of key takeaways, right, from the webinar. It's been such a broad-ranging, like, topic areas, and I think that it would be really nice if we just get to a couple of questions towards the end as well, because there's a lot that's actually been funneled through by our participants. I think maybe just for me, just to sort of like level set, I think that, you know, we're continuously seeing so much change within the market, right? And I think actually change is now the new norm, and I think technology, AI, and understanding of your data, surfacing that data to create insights is actually table stakes, right? I think that's actually where organizations need to go. And that's where, in the future, where competitive advantage will come from, right? And I think from this panel discussion, could have gone on for 3-4 hours, right? There's absolute thesis on each of these topic areas, but I think that would be probably my main takeaway from now. Bjorn, you're top of my screen, so any thoughts from you?
I think it's patently obvious that we need this.
Right.
It's equally obvious that we've needed it for a very long time, and various people have talked about it, and very few people have cracked the code. I think it's very advantageous, if something good has come out of this whole fiasco, that supply chain management and logistics visibility is now top of mind at the boardroom level. It's mentioned in quarterly reports and annual reports prominently, not for many good things, but it's mentioned and it exists, and there's a huge awareness now in companies that it's time to get some of our investment capital flowing in the direction of this. So the time is good for it, and I can't wait.
Great. And Judah, from yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree. I mean, you know, operationally, we're looking at freight rate data to understand what's going on in the market, and that itself is kind of a logistics technology progress. It's benefits from the digitization of freight rates and the ability to see these things on a near real time basis. but yeah, at Freightos as well, this is something that we've seen over the course of the pandemic that really, obviously there's been a trend towards digitization and, digital tools to make things more efficient and cost effective across the supply chain. From even before the pandemic, we've definitely seen an acceleration of that trend over the course of the pandemic. And I think, as Bjorn said, that, that's going to continue. In a survey we did of enterprise shippers, there's a real desire to be involved in supply chain decisions, right? So BCOs really want to be on top of their supply chain. They want that visibility that we've been talking about in terms of ETA and about other things. When we look at kind of the top things that they want in terms of procurement is the ability to see all their options and compare them and make decisions. But at the same time, nearly half of them said those things were difficult to do. It was difficult to do things easily, especially as kind of, Excel is kind of the big freight rate or freight management tool that a lot of shippers are still using. But there's been progress at Freightos as well. We have pilots that enable that kind of visibility and e-booking for enterprise shippers, and that's steps along the way that are getting towards this kind of end-to-end connectivity, which is really going to change things for the better across the supply chain.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Judah. Dani, from your end, any sort of closing remarks on this rather complex issue?
Sure. So I think, in AI in general, there's like digital problems, so there's digital assets, like you have a photo and AI would kind of, apply a filter on your Facebook page. And I think the next generation of AI is what, is called like AI that solves real world problems. Meaning, AI takes some decision and it has some effect in real life, right? Before Windward, I worked in mobility, so there, AI would configure traffic lights. And here, like AI gives prediction, and according to those prediction, people would move the day where, the truck comes by to ship the cargo, and things change. And I think the next evolution of AI is moving from the digital world, right, which affects online stuff, to the real world where it affects, real things in the real world, like, ships and dates and goods and stuff like that. And, this is why I came to Windward. I'm super excited about those problems in general. I like to see, the AI take effect in real life. Yeah. So that's one takeaway. The other takeaway is that I hope you can take my word for it. This problem is unsolvable in any other means except for AI. If you already came with AI to solve a problem, everything else failed, right? Because it takes a long time, it's hard. And that's it from my side.
Thanks, Dani. I really appreciate that. Gilles, I'm conscious of everyone's time. Have we got 30 seconds for one question and then we'll close out?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So we did get a few questions from the Q&A, but I think we're probably going to have time to just answer one. So forgive me for picking kind of randomly, but the one that we chose is, what should we expect the container prices trend to look like in the coming weeks and months? If anybody wants to give it a shot.
Is that Judah?
Sure. Of course, it's very hard to make predictions. As we said, there's a lot of different moving parts. There's growing inventories in certain sectors, as Bjorn pointed out. It's not even inventories across everything, although it's something new that we've seen. There's indications of kind of decreasing in consumer demand, especially on the Trans-Pacific, especially as inflation gets worse. On the other hand, we still have congestion, which is sucking up capacity and changing things. So there's a lot in flux. As I said, it's very unusual at this time of year on the Trans-Pacific to see rates falling instead of climbing on peak season. So what happens as we get deeper into peak season, as Bjorn also mentioned, is another question mark. So it's exceedingly difficult to say where we expect freight rates to be, but I think those are kind of the factors. What's happening with consumer demand? What's happening with congestion as we move forward? Those are the factors that are going to determine which way freight rates go. But as I said, with the significant decreases we've seen, whether it's in freight rates or some improvement in congestion at some ports but not others, or in terms of projections of volumes dropping, we're starting from a very, very high starting place. So I think that the consensus is that these things are going to take time, and we're not going to see a very quick unwinding or a very quick return to kind of what we were used to pre-pandemic. So very difficult to say, but I think whatever happens is going to take time.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for those insights, Judah. I mean, Bjorn, do you have a crystal ball on your end? You have no idea what's going to happen next?
If I had, I wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be on my yacht in the Bahamas, having traded freight futures, which does bring me to the point I was going to make. There is actually a forward curve. It's imperfect, but it does exist, because there does exist by now reasonably well-developed market for freight futures, container freight futures, including bunker. It's imperfect in that it doesn't have a whole lot of lanes. But it can give us a very interesting forward curve, which happens the job with our own gut feeling. Some of us have been through these times before, albeit not to these levels of extreme, that this will not be a rates all of a sudden fall off the cliff kind of thing. I think that correction, as Judah was talking about, that has taken place. Now you'll see rates perhaps going down a little bit more. They'll find a level, but they'll come back up again. Peak is, I don't think there will be much of a peak. I think there'll be ghost peaks. I think the peak is the time's run out for that, because don't forget, again, I want to go back to this concept of lead time or lag time. You can detect an increased consumer demand signal, but it doesn't mean you can call up your factory in China tomorrow and say, ship me 1,000 boxes. It can take 3 months before those boxes appear on a ship, right? But what the forward curves tell us on every trade is, except for the trade TP westbounds, which are always flat at atrociously low rates, is that this is going to be a long slide down to a certain level in 2004. And there's going to be blips along the way, all right? But when anybody is sitting here hoping in the next 2 weeks or 4 weeks that the rates are going to take a nosedive, I don't believe it.
Dream on.
If they're going to take a sharp correction, is the last thing I say. If there's going to be a sharp correction, it's going to come in next year's tenders.
Right.
That will be interesting to watch.
Yeah, I would just add, as Bjorn already made that plug, but yeah, among those, the Freightos Baltic Index is used to underpin freight futures, which are traded on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. Yeah, which is also a development, which I think also you can attribute to to digital progress that made that kind of visibility possible, and that kind of hedge of this volatility that we've seen also possible when combined with index linking.
Correct.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. We're at time. In fact, we're a little bit over. Gilles, anything from your side, or we'll close out?
Yeah, I think we're good. Sorry for going over time. I'd like to thank once again everybody who attended, and of course our great panelists. I think it was a great discussion, and we hope that you enjoyed it too. I know there were a few questions that weren't answered, and if you have additional questions that you want to ask us, you're more than invited to send them in reply to the summary email you'll get from Windward, and we're going to try to answer all of those questions directly to those who posed them. So yeah, we'll do everything we can for everybody to get their answers through. You're also invited to check out Windward's blog, where you'll find plenty of insights on market trends and various topics related to the supply chain industry. Just go to windward.ai/blog. So yeah, that's pretty much it for today. We look forward to seeing you all on the next webinar. And I'd like to thank everybody once again for being with us here today. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you, and take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, thanks.